Today we're gonna have a somewhat of a lengthier lecture than I usually do on what's called the new imperialism. And this was differentiated from old imperialism, which we'll talk about, but it really was somewhat unique to the 1800s, especially the late 1800s in Africa, earlier 1800s in Asia. So first, we'll start off with the definition of imperialism, which is when one group controls another group, whether it's political, economic, or cultural. And really, let's talk about the old imperialism. So between the 16th and 18th century, this is kind of what we've already talked about, is you had, let me just shift a bit. So you really had European powers. They didn't really want to acquire lots and lots of territory. It was really about just really trading stations. So the Portuguese had their trading posts in Africa and Indonesia. That, of course, was for the spice trade. And really the African slave trade going on in the New World, which we've talked about. The Netherlands established trading posts in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. But again, it was really just about trade. They cooperated with some of the Asian countries, but again, just pretty much on the coast. Now, the New World is your exception, where there, as we've talked about, Spain just conquered entire swaths of the country. And Native Americans in Mesoamerica, South America, they crushed them, of course, and we have certainly talked about that. So England, of course, colonizing the east coast of North America, our 13 colonies, and then France in Canada. So again, the Western Hemisphere is a little bit of your exception. Now, another factor that drives some of this imperialism is between 1815 and 1932, 60 million people leave Europe. And at the time, that is just a large, large number. And they pretty much are going to go to these European inhabited areas, North, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Siberia. And the European migration proved a further, is this big impetus for all this Western expansion. Now, the new imperialism really begins 1880s in Africa, earlier in Asia, but we'll start with Africa. And in 1800, Europeans controlled about 7% of the world's territory. By 1914, 84%. British Empire has half of the world's population. And by 1900, 20% of the world's territory. And the expression was the empire upon which the sun never sets. Or sometimes I've seen that said as the sun never sets on the British Empire. So you literally could travel around the world and move through British territories, including Australia, Canada, India, colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And just you can look at that map and see the red. Since we're talking about imperialism this week, I wanted to share with you one of the more interesting items in my collection of oddities. So this is my grandfather's stamp collection. He collected stamps from about the late 1920s to about the 1960s. And so what's interesting is with a lot of them, this is a little history lesson of stuff. So this album here was actually a special commemorative set put together for Edward the Eighth, I think. This is the current Queen Elizabeth's father. And so this was in like 1937. And so what you can see, what's interesting about it is all these special stamps, a lot of these places are British colonies and they're no longer colonies. So you can really get a sense of the British Empire by flipping through this album. So let me just show you some of the more interesting pages. And this is a big empire. This album has a lot of pages. Obviously needs some new binding, but, being 80 years old. So you can see all these various islands out in places. And Again, the Falkland Islands, site of a war in the 1980s. Fiji, again, they sure do like their islands. So you got African colonies, Kenya, Uganda, Hong Kong, of course. And again, I don't really know how valuable these are, but it is definitely an interesting slice of history. And a lot of these places are in what's today called the British Commonwealth. Let's see. There's Rhodesia. St. Helena, not the place up in Napa. That's actually where Napoleon died. Sierra Leone in Africa. Let's see. And then, here you go, special stamps for Edward VIII. Same guy. So anyway, you get the idea. I don't need to go through the whole album, but South Africa. Anyway, so that is a little slice of imperialism. So Europeans colonized Africa and Asia, and they would, for the process was they would use force to take control of the local governments. And really, there was a lot of it looking for raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution. But they would justify this by saying, well, we're civilizing the backwards people. And then Britain, the way they controlled Egypt in the 1880s, became this model for that new imperialism. So major causes, what drives this? Like, what about the 1880s? So as I mentioned, search for new markets and raw materials, that is a big deal. The Industrial Revolution created a surplus of goods. Capitalists, you need your new markets. And then the new markets are elusive because the people they can't buy your goods. So as you can see from the stat about Germany, their trade, internationally, it was not much of a percentage. I moved the camera not to make you disjointed, but it's a better spot for it. But France imported more goods from its colonies than it sold to them. And just raw materials, some of what you have going on, ivory and rubber from the Congo, diamonds from South Africa, cocoa in Niger, tea in China, in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, cotton from India. So these really were just these materials all coming in. Now, another factor in this was actually missionary work. And so there's this strong revivalism going on, and really the middle classes, they really felt sincerely that it was important to, for Christianity to spread it to Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but later in Islamic Northern Africa. So important guy is Dr. David Livingstone, who's the first white man to do humanitarian work. And he's really in South Africa, kind of going around there. Really interesting guy. Unlike many Europeans, respected the natives, and just a generally good guy. There is me. They actually have a statue of him at Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. I was there in 2018. So there's the statue of Livingstone and me with all my dad gear as we were out hiking. Now, an American reporter, Stanley, finds Livingstone, who really was not actually in any danger and perfectly happy, but giving us the famous quote, "Livingstone, I presume." And really, Stanley later goes on, he writes these books for the American and British public, which really popularize imperialism. And he seeks the aid of the King of Belgium to dominate the Congo region, which is going to have its own serious, serious consequences and one of the great tragedies of this era. Another factor driving it was military and naval bases. So now that you're getting into all these rivalries with the European powers, and you read about nationalism, hopefully, and Germany being on the scene and France and all these countries fighting with each other. So now everybody gets concerned about that. So of course it's kind of an arms race where each base you get means the other person grabs a base, and nobody wants to be left out and end up with nothing good left. And so the other factor is ideology plays a role. So the whole idea of social Darwinism, which we've also you read about, where the idea that Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest can apply to societies. And so, well, the fittest species is going to be the one to conquer. This also leads us into scientific racism, which we'll get more into. And ultimately, it's a way to justify military superiority and conquest by Europeans, because as we've said, no one's, likes to think they're wrong, because everybody's got to sleep at night. Now, an example of this imperialist urge is the poem White Man's Burden, which you've maybe heard. It's by Rudyard Kipling. Most famous to us more recently is from the Jungle Book. But basically, it preached that the superior Westerners, you've got to bring your uncivilized stuff. We're going to use it as a primary source this week, but it is a factor. And again, that's kind of what it's called. And again, Europeans have to justify what they're doing. So here it is, part of it. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. And of course, that is speaking as an imperialist. Now, Germany and Russia use these especially, and they divert attention from the class struggle, use it to kind of group their people together. It's all about national pride. So again, all these factors going on. And really, this leads to one of the more shameful chapters in our course. It's the scramble for Africa. So in 1880, they controlled 10% of it. And by 1914, they've got everything but Liberia and Ethiopia. And this was fueled by that nationalism, all those factors, ideology, social Darwinism. But really it starts when Europeans can get into the African interior. And a factor in this is actually medicine, because there were a couple diseases, malaria and African sleeping sickness, that Western medicine figures out how to conquer. And that, in combination with the steamboat, lets you go upstream to those rivers in Africa, and that becomes a big deal. Now, the Congo especially is kind of scary, because it, unlike the other colonies which were run by the countries, it actually becomes a personal colony of King Leopold of Belgium. So it's run like as his personal playground almost. Pretty scary. And that leads to all kinds of scary stuff. So the Berlin Conference, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, recognizes the Congo as Leopold's personal possession. And this just becomes savage. They're looking for rubber and ivory. People get mutilated. The Belgian parliament tries to crack down on this. They take it away. But really, it's ranked as a genocide, his reign in the Congo. And really, what should happen. So here you can see a picture that just shows what happened if you didn't meet the rubber quotas, and you can see the people with missing limbs. And it was just more horrifying even than these pictures do justice to. A book you can take a look at is called King Leopold's Ghost, all about this. And again, obviously, the British cartoon critiquing the whole process. Now, Britain's control of Egypt becomes this model, and we've said this already, but so they overthrow this guy, Muhammad Ali, in 1849, who'd made Egypt independent, but he ended up owing them some money. And really, in 1865, they then buy it, and really, a lot of it's about the Suez Canal. So a lot of this is strategic, because the Suez Canal is sort of, allows the Persian Gulf, or the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. And that becomes strategically very important. So in 1883, Britain declares it a protectorate. And really, it's the protection of the Suez Canal. So in some ways, the story of Britain and Africa is that the more they grab, the more they have to protect. Um, and so, although Egypt's part of the Ottoman Empire officially, the British still control it. So, and again, you can see the tentacles spreading. Um, and it's really until 1956, actually. So, some of this stuff goes on a long time. There again is a French cartoon critiquing all the British Empire is like the tentacles of an octopus. Now, let's talk more about this Berlin Conference, which is sort of this apotheosis of European sort of hegemony and power. So, it establishes these rules for conquest. And, well, if we're going to carve up the place, let's make some rules. You basically can't claim something before you control it. Slavery's terminated, although in effect it was still around. Sought to, you're charged, and they're really, this conference is to keep conflict from happening. Although ultimately this is how going to help fuel World War I. So German Chancellor Bismarck and the guy in France, Jules Ferry. And really it is starting to show Germany's arrival on the scene. And in 1914, all but 2 countries control stuff. So if you really look at the map, you can see a lot going on here where, just it kind of speaks for itself what they controlled. And a lot of it was also drawing the borders. So again, not everybody was happy with it. Here you see a Thomas Nast cartoon, famous American cartoonist, critiquing. But really, the British are the big kahunas in Africa, and they're the ones that are really driving this. So they take over Egypt. But then because they have Egypt, yes, you have to protect the Suez Canal, but they then also realize you have to control the Nile. And so because they were always terrified of somebody taking control of the Nile, they then had to push further south to take control of this. So they then push into the Sudan, and at the Battle of Omdurman, this guy Horatio Kitchener, who is going to be important in World War I, you can just sort of see the mismatch with 11,000 Sudanese with machine guns, only 28 Britons died. And then there's an incident called the Fashoda incident, which is really just showing how these countries could go to war over some of these places. But the reality is it's just all are here, and you can see sort of the Nile here. Now, down in South Africa, where the British, if you remember, had taken over in the 1770s, the tension between the descendants of the Dutch settlers, called the Boers, which means farmer in Afrikaans, became a problem. So Cecil Rhodes, who is this big prime minister in South Africa, the country of Rhodesia actually becomes named after him. He becomes the minister of the Cape Colony, and he's the principal sponsor of the Cape to Cairo dream, where Britain's going to dominate Africa. We'll take a look at a cartoon in a minute. Once they discover diamonds and gold in the one part of South Africa, that means the Boers had fled the British part of South Africa. So once they discover gold there, of course, just like anything, then all of a sudden people want it. This is a cartoon which just shows Cecil Rhodes astride Africa. And he was that important a guy. While we're on the subject of Cecil Rhodes, I just wanted to share a couple of things. So I was in South Africa, as I mentioned, like late December, January 2018, 2019. And Cecil Rhodes's presence is everywhere. So first, most of the African colonies got their independence sometime in the 1960s. The last one to really hold out was the country of Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe. But you can see on the map here, it was named after Cecil Rhodes. He also actually, when you hear the word Rhodes Scholar, that's actually one of his better legacies. But when we were there, you see him in some interesting places. One of the biggest brands of groceries and juice, you can see here, was Rhodes Juice. And I saw that in a lot of places. Another interesting thing we found at a flea market, this was from 1960. I wouldn't recommend drinking it, but it's a bottle of something from Rhodesia Railways from about 1960s, so it says on the label. And again, just a little piece of that. Another thing we found at the similar flea market was this, which says Coins of Rhodesia, and you can see the original coinage that they used up until really 1979. And there you go. And I know I showed you at one point the Zimbabwe money in the economic principles lecture, so hasn't necessarily fared that well. He also has these big gardens in Cape Town that are named after him. So his presence, even today, looms pretty large. And here, of course, you can see the map. And this is where they were. This is where the Boers had fled to. But once you discover that gold, you are going to go out there. And even in South Africa today, you still have those two distinct groups. Well, not counting the native Africans, of course. But you have Boers and British descendants of British. So the Boers initially are successful in repelling stuff. Germany tries to meddle. Kaiser Wilhelm was kind of a doofus who just tries to meddle in things. Eventually, the Boers are conquered by the British, but it takes years longer than they expected. It's one of the first uses of concentration camps. They have to use guerrilla warfare. Just kind of an ugly, ugly chapter in that part of the history. But by 1890, Britain controls Nigeria, Uganda, and Zanzibar. Germany recognizes British control, and England is the big deals here. And so here you can just see this is the map of British Africa. All the pink, that is a lot of territory. And as you can see, they definitely were trying to get in the Nile. Was definitely the thing. And Rhodesia, of course, gets named after him. Today, that's the country of Zimbabwe. Now, French in Africa, they come a little late to the party. They don't end up with as much. Primarily, it's Algeria, which they own until the 1960s. Tunisia, these are things in North Africa. And again, it's always the excuse of, well, somebody did something to us. And then the French take control of some of the stuff in northern Congo, Somaliland, later on, Madagascar. But again, it's all part of this scramble for Africa. So here you can see the French, and they're the light blue. But again, it's all these countries doing all this stuff. Now, Germany. Since Germany wasn't unified until 1871, they're sort of getting the sloppy seconds. There's not much left. So prior to 1884, Bismarck had not really been interested, but all of a sudden, with Russia and those other countries getting empires, we got to get in on it. So again, they organized the Berlin Conference, which we've talked about. This guarantees that Germany is now going to be a major player, and they set about establishing these small protectorates. And by World War I, they actually control more territory than is actually in Germany. And again, without getting too much into the specifics, Cameroon, Togoland, Tanganyika, which is all kind of Zanzibar now, or Tanzania. They've easily done. There's business interests, etc., and all pretty. So you can see here the Germans don't get much, but again, everybody's got to get in on the act. Italy is the real latecomer. They took them a while to get their act together. Pretty much, they end up with Ethiopia, and you can see it here, and just not terribly much. And then lastly, Portugal, Angola, and pretty much kind of keeping slavery. And again, it's the descendants of those trading ports that they ran.